Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man. Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
Hey, welcome back to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I am your host, Ben Pakulski, and today we're going to talk to one of the most 100 influential people in health and fitness. This guy has appeared in Time Magazine multiple times on Dr. Oz, Fox TV, Joe Rogan, so he's a pretty great guy, pretty influential. He's an expert in functional medicine, Chinese integrated medicine, and talks a lot about health optimization and how to use nutrition, stress management, and sleep optimization to really live your best life and live it in your best body. Today we welcome Mr. Kresser, and we're going to talk about a lot of really interesting stuff. So Chris wrote a book called The Paleo Cure, talking about how an elimination diet is a really good way to start living a healthy life. Chris had a really interesting experience in his 20s, and he tells you how his microbiome was absolutely ripped apart and how he built it back up from basically zero, and all the negative side effects he experienced during that phase, and how he got back to living optimal health and living optimal brain function. We talk a little bit about the HPTG axis, and we add the gonads in there because a lot of us are really interested in how to optimize testosterone, and how that's all going to be working together and intertwine with the hypothalamus and pituitary. We talk about some interesting methods of hormetic stress for the mitochondria and energy production, and we talk about an interesting topic that I'm super interested in, something called exposomics, which is basically what your body's exposed to from the instant of inception to basically right now in time or space, or the way science defines it, till the moment you die, and how all of those things influence your life. So it's not just about your genetics, it's about your exposomics and your epigenetics: diet, activity, environment, air, pollution, social interactions, stress, every single thing, and how that's going to influence your genetic expression. You're not going to want to miss a minute of this one. We really get into a deep dive toward the end that you guys are going to love hearing about. And Chris is a really health-conscious doc who really is influencing a lot of high-level performers like Olympic athletes and Hollywood superstars. So enjoy the show, and as always, if you enjoy it, share it with someone who you think will benefit from it, because we all know someone who's living a life that could be improved with just a little bit of attention paid to the intricacies of nutrition, sleep optimization, maybe it's the environment, and we all know someone who could benefit from this information. So go ahead and give us a share, leave us a review. I appreciate you as always. Have an awesome day and enjoy the episode. This episode is brought to you by the Mi40 Nation, guys. If you're interested in muscle building, this is your number one resource for muscle building information, exercise mastery, and all the intricacies of building your best body, living your best life, and how to balance the little things that nobody thinks about. You guys know for 20 years that I lived the life of the most committed, dedicated bodybuilder on the planet. And I learned a lot, and I made a lot of mistakes, and I don't want you to make a lot of mistakes. And right now we're launching something called HEM, Hypertrophy Execution Mastery, and you're going to absolutely love this. This is effectively what we teach when you come into our camps. Spend 3 days with me and the team and learn all of our best information on body part mastery. So we all have a weak body part. We all have something we wish was a little bit bigger, a little bit better, maybe a little bit harder. Maybe we don't feel it very well. And we're going to teach you every single thing there is to know about this. And the best part is it's designed for your body type, not for my body type, not for some YouTube celebrity's body type. We're going to teach you how to do it best for your body type, as well as giving you a framework so that it's not like you have to remember every one of our intricate little points. We're going to teach you a framework so you can remember every little bit of it and take it to the gym with you in your gym bag every time, so you have an arsenal of tools that let you leave the gym feeling like you have an S on your chest. So if you guys want to check that out, head over to mi40nation.com or executionmastery.com. Enjoy the show. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Expert Podcast. I am your host, Ben Pakulski, and today we're going deep. Let me do that one more time. Hey, what's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Expert Podcast. I am your host, Ben Pakulski, and today we are going deep on health and how you guys are going to optimize it to improve your fitness and your performance. Ultimately, we all want to build our greatest body, live our greatest life, and Mr. Chris Kessner is here to give us some tremendous insights into what he's been doing in the last 15 years of advising people on health optimization. How you doing, Chris?
I'm great, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So I first heard of Chris when I was exposed to his Revolution Health Radio podcast, which is an amazing resource. Chris dives deep on some really, really interesting topics. You're actually a world-renowned speaker, Chris. I mean, we've seen you on places like Dr. Oz, Time Magazine, Joe Rogan Podcast, Fox TV, some pretty awesome places, man. So congratulations on that, and thank you very much for being here.
Oh, thanks. It's my pleasure. This is what I live for.
Yeah, it is. So, man, the way I want to start it is, what are you excited about right now? Because, I've read through a lot of your stuff, and, there's a lot of things that I could lead you down a lot of paths, epigenetics, exposomics, in the future of medicine, so many things that I'd like to hear about, and I think I'd like to get to at some level, but sometimes the best way to start any conversation is like, what are you excited about right now? What are you reading? What are you super pumped to be digging into right now?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think when I first started my journey, my immediate goal was to recover my own health. Mm-hmm. That's often how many of us start. And because I got sick while traveling when I was in my 20s, and we could talk about that later.
Yeah, tell me about that sickness. I'd love to hear about that.
So I took off in my early 20s to do an around the world. The plan was to be gone for a year and a half. Kind of sold everything I owned, and it was something I'd always wanted to do. And about halfway through that trip, I was in Indonesia doing some surfing. That's mostly what I was wanted to do on that trip, and because I'm a lifelong surfer. And when I was in this little village on an island called Sumbawa, there was a pool of stagnant water that some cows were milling around in and defecating in, and the locals didn't unfortunately know much about sanitation, dug a trench between that and the river there that was going out into the ocean. So, a lot of good surf spots are river mouths, and this was no exception. And all of the people, there was maybe a handful of people staying there surfing, and we all got sick.
Wow.
And it was the classic tropical illness that you hear about, vomiting, diarrhea, delirium. Don't really remember much of what happened for those 3 days. And an Australian guy that was in the village had some antibiotics in his medical kit, and that brought me back from the brink, the immediate acute aspect of the illness, but it evolved into a really complex chronic condition that took me about a decade to recover from.
Jeez.
Yeah.
So was it like disruptings to the microbiome primarily?
Yeah, and there were ended up being 3 different parasite infections, and then I took multiple treatments to get rid of that. But then the treatments themselves did arguably more damage than the infections, and it just really rocked me. And for a few years I couldn't work. I couldn't. I was non-functional basically.
Talk to me about that. Yeah, you said the treatments caused more harm than the parasites, because that seems to be a very commonly articulated response to a lot of the treatments that people are exposed to.
Yeah, the doctors I saw were trying to help. They were doing their best, but they just weren't really trained for that kind of situation. And so I took a bunch of antibiotics, and that just wiped out my beneficial gut microbes, and that not only caused worsening of the GI symptoms, it also caused things like, extreme muscle fatigue and muscle pain and joint pain, extreme insomnia. There were times where I was sleeping 2-3 hours a night for many months on end, and I basically reached a point where I didn't know if I was going to make it. I was in my 20s. It was supposed to be a really different time, but I couldn't work. I couldn't function. I spent a lot of the day, just in pain, kind of curled up in a ball on the floor. And I didn't know if I'd be able to have a career, get married, have kids, like all the things that I had imagined for myself had just sort of I didn't know if any of that was going to be in the cards. And so after I saw probably 25 or 30 different doctors. I flew to 2 different countries to see specialists, and nobody could figure out what was going on. So I decided to take matters into my own hands, because at the end of the day, nobody cares more about your health than you do.
Sure.
And did a very deep dive into exploration, experimentation with diet, special diets, and all kinds of different treatments, everything from drugs to supplements to herbs to, energy healing. I mean, you name it, I did it. And then eventually I started to find my way out of it and recover my health. And after a few years of getting back on my feet, and people around me started to ask me, hey, what did you learn? Because I saw what you went through and where you are now, and I want to know what you figured out along the way. And that's when I, prior to that, I hadn't really considered healthcare as a career, and that's when I started to think about, maybe I can help other people who are dealing with similar challenges, maybe not as extreme, but who are struggling with health problems and not finding answers in the conventional system. And so I went back to school.
This is the absolute perfect segue, though. I mean, prior to talking about going to school, because I'd like to talk about what you did in school, but this is the perfect segue, because I think a lot of our listeners are going through the same thing you're going through, and it may not be to the same extent, but so many people in their youth are exposed to excessive amounts of antibiotics. And I'd love for you to talk about what you did kind of step by step to reacquire those healthy microbiome or the healthy bacteria, and if there's anything that you've maybe evolved since that would accelerate that process, or things you may have done differently in the process.
Yeah, so I mean, at the time I was doing this, there was a lot less known about this subject than there is now. It was kind of the Wild West still, and a lot of doctors still didn't even know anything about probiotics, or we hadn't seen articles about the microbiome on the cover of Time magazine, and it wasn't a mainstream word like it is now, so it was a little more difficult to figure it out. But the good news is the traditional medicine and even Western medicine back in the early 1900s has been aware of this stuff, so it's not like it's new. And it was a long, slow process because of the amount of damage that had been done. But I started with an approach called the GAPS diet, which is kind of a variant of a paleo type of diet. It's a completely grain-free diet that's nutrient dense, and it differs from a standard type of paleo diet, and it really emphasizes bone broth, which is really healing for the gut. And it also removes starch completely, so no sweet potatoes or plantains or other things that would be fair game on a standard paleo type of diet. And the idea is just to remove everything that can potentially aggravate the gut, and then to really load up on things that nourish and heal the gut, like bone broth, fermented foods like sauerkraut, and eventually, when I was able to tolerate it, kefir and yogurt and things like beet kvass, like tons and tons of fermented foods which have the beneficial bacteria in them. And then, the bone broth, the really nourishing, nutrient-dense foods, soups, stocks, stews, etc. And then once I was able to start tolerating them, adding back those starches and fermentable fibers that actually provide the food for the beneficial gut bacteria. And that's very important for people to understand. It's not just about probiotics, which are the bacteria themselves. You also have to feed them. And what feeds them is fiber. So early on, when you have a really dysfunctional gut, most people can't tolerate very much fiber because their gut is so messed up. But then over time, as you start to heal, it's really important to bring that fiber back in and increase it, because the fiber doesn't feed us. We can't absorb it. That's the definition of fiber, but it feeds the bacteria. So at some point, this is what I tell my patients, with every bite of food you put into your mouth, you should be asking 2 questions. How is this going to nourish me, and how is it going to nourish my gut microbiome?
Absolutely. Tell me about some of the symptoms you're experiencing during this phase where your microbiome was so depleted, and then as you started to kind of reacclimatize and reintroduce these bacteria, some of the physical symptoms. Maybe was there a high predisposition to illness? Just walk us through how you were feeling and how it started to evolve.
Yeah, so very gradually as I started to restore my gut health and replenish my microbiome, I started to the pain started to lessen. That was a big deal because the pain was so excruciating. Like a 9 on a scale of 1 to 10 in some cases, where literally I was curled up in a ball on the floor because I was in such intense pain. And I have a pretty high pain threshold and have had my whole life, and been in martial arts and lots of stuff. So I was kind of shocked by how debilitating the pain was. And once the pain started to recede, that allowed me to begin to do other things that were beneficial, to start being more physically active and resume some of my other self-care practices like my meditation practice. And some of the gut symptoms, the indigestion and the bloating and all of those symptoms started to go away. And then my energy started to improve. And this was happening gradually. It was definitely not an overnight process, but over a period of months and then even years, I got back to a place where I felt like I could live the life that I wanted to live. And the reason I put it that way is because people often say, "Oh, well, did you get back to where you were before you got sick?" And I say my answer to that is no, but how do we even know where, that this was 10 years later? So, it's like...
Did it really take that long for you to recover from that process?
Yeah, well, it took about 2.5 years to even figure out what was going on. I mean, this is part of what we'll talk about, where conventional medicine is not set up to diagnose these kinds of complex conditions, especially in the U.S., where these kinds of illnesses are not typically seen like they are in Australia. They're a little bit further ahead because of the proximity of Australia to Southeast Asia and some of these countries. But in my case, because it was a parasitic type of tropical illness, it was not something that your average primary care doctor in the U.S. even knew how to diagnose. Right. So it was difficult to figure it out.
Chris, speak to me about some of the other manifestations you're experiencing. You're saying you're in extreme pain. You had some muscle aches and pains, and telling me a little bit about what they were and how they manifested. And looking back at it, now knowing what you know now, what do you think it was?
Well, I couldn't really even just stand for more than 15 minutes without feeling like I ran a marathon. I couldn't. My exercise tolerance, I went from someone who was a competitive athlete and who, I was almost played basketball in college, and I was a lifelong martial artist, and, I had a very, very active, past experience and was extremely physically active to barely being able to take a walk. Which was pretty hard to take, in my early 20s. And then the joint and muscle pain was so bad that when I laid down to sleep at night, I just, I couldn't sleep. I had the kind of restless leg syndrome symptoms where the longer that I was stationary, like in a lying down position, the more restless my legs would get, to where I would have to basically turn over every 2 or 3 minutes or move my body in order to, alleviate the pain a little bit. And that, of course, if you're moving every 2 or 3 minutes, you're not sleeping, or at least you're not sleeping very well. And then that became a vicious cycle where the less you sleep, the more it exacerbates the restless leg and the muscle fatigue and pain, because sleep is where tissue regeneration and repair happens. So it just became this really brutal downward spiral. And, no matter what I did, I couldn't seem to get out of it initially, until I was able to treat the parasites and then start to rebuild the microbiome and my health in the way that I mentioned.
So obviously, it sounds as though it was massively influencing your mitochondria's ability to produce energy, right? And we now know the connection between the microbiome and mitochondria is substantial. So that's kind of where I wanted to go with that. Is what type of effects did you feel, and how could you, looking back on it, influence the mitochondria a little more successfully? Would it have been some attempt to expose yourself to some type of hormetic stress? Because I know there's people out there, typically people and you'll recognize these demographics too, the people who are typically 50 years old plus, maybe it's postmenopausal women who are experiencing massive lulls in energy and they're unsure why it is. And obviously there's hormonal considerations, but from my experience, influencing people's mitochondria is a really great way to start influencing energy production. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, knowing what I know now, a couple things I probably would have done that I didn't do as much, although there were some challenges, which I'll say after that, would be like a ketogenic diet and fasting, both of which can be pretty powerful modulators of mitochondrial function. The tricky thing about fasting in particular, and to a lesser extent keto for me at that time, was that I was already extremely underweight. Because of the parasite illness and the interference of absorbing food. But it's, I still work with patients on this sort of thing. And sometimes weight, and whether it's underweight or overweight, is not the first thing that you focus on. You have to get the body functioning normally again, and then the weight will take care of itself, whether the person is underweight or overweight. So I think fasting and ketogenic diet can be super helpful, triggers for mitochondrial function. Hot and cold therapy, actually, something I still do now. We have a sauna at home, and I do sauna and cold plunges. I think that's one of the best ways to address mitochondrial function.
How often are you doing that, Chris?
Several times a week, typically, depending on my schedule. 3-4 times a week, usually.
Do you prefer the cold plunge compared to the cold sauna, like the cryo saunas?
I don't have easy access to a cryo sauna at this point, so the cold plunge is what happens. I enjoy just the feeling of going back and forth between a really hot sauna and then a cold plunge. That just, I feel amazing after that.
What protocol have you found works best for you?
For me, I experiment with different things, and it's generally I'll go in the sauna first, and depending on the temperature, it could be 15 to 20 minutes. And then I'll do like a 3-minute cold plunge, usually 2 to 3 minute cold plunge. Then another round in the sauna, another cold plunge, and depending on how much time I have that day, that might be it, or it might be a third round.
Awesome. And you have these actually right in your house?
This is a big deal for me last year, where we set this up as something I've wanted to do for a long time. We had the sauna first, but then we had to set up a cold plunge. So that was the next big step.
Yeah, big undertaking. So now, is it an infrared or just a normal high heat sauna?
Had the infrared sauna, and then but the barrel sauna, a barrel dry sauna, I think works better for this because. Okay. It's hotter, and that means you can. It's pretty hard to heat up in an infrared sauna after the cold plunge. That's the disadvantage of those. So, but if you have a dry or barrel sauna that gets super hot, then it's easier to go back and forth.
So talk about some of the mitochondrial benefits to the contrast therapies, because I think people are familiar with them, but I don't know that anyone's ever really given a good explanation as to actually what's happening.
Well, you mentioned it before, which is hormesis. Most things that benefit us from a longevity perspective and even, mitochondrial perspective are actually stressors on the body. And there's a difference between eustress and distress. So eustress is a beneficial stress, and distress is a maladaptive stress, or a destructive stress. So if you go to the gym and you lift weights, and you're actually tearing down muscle tissue, but when the muscle tissue regrows, it regrows such that it can face that challenge, better that you just gave it with the weights the next time you lift weights. And that's actually an adaptive evolutionary response, because if you consider like a natural environment, humans living, thousands of years ago in a natural environment, if they faced a challenge that they weren't able to meet, they may not survive. So the body adapts to that in a way that would be more likely to protect their survival in that situation. And that kind of adaptation is called a hormetic adaptation. It's a response to stress that is positive adaptation that would promote better survival in a natural environment. But of course today, it's not so much about survival, but that's how our bodies are still hardwired. So if you do something like you go in a sauna, which is a lot hotter than, we would typically experience, or you go in a cold plunge, which is cold, that triggers that adaptation, that hormetic adaptation, and it upregulates processes like autophagy, which is our cellular cleanup and repair process. It sort of kickstarts the mitochondria into high gear and it gets them functioning better, because the body in a way is kind of gearing up in a fashion that would promote better evolutionary fitness. So that's kind of the best way, I think, to describe it, because people, you're essentially doing things that are going to make you better adapted to your environment.
So continuing the conversation around environment, some of the stuff that I've read on your website, Kresser.com, for all of our listeners, exposomics and epigenetics. So basically what we're being exposed to from the moment of inception all the way through our life, and how that's going to influence epigenetic expression. I'd love for you to start having a conversation around that, because up until just a couple of years ago, we were so set in the idea of our genetics determining our future and our existence, but now we know it's so much more to that. Tell me about some of the things in that area that you're excited about.
Some people are still focused on that. Actually, I've been reading some books on AI, artificial intelligence, and some of these transhumanists who believe we're going to merge with machines and who are predicting that AI is going to solve all disease. The reason they predict that is that they're still operating in this mindset that genes hold the key to chronic disease, and we're just going to figure out a certain genes that cause cancer and certain genes that cause Alzheimer's disease, and once we figure that out, we'll just use something like CRISPR to edit those genes and we'll be fine, and that's the end of the story. Unfortunately, that's completely out of step with what science has shown to be true about chronic disease. If only it were that simple, that would be nice. But the reality is that 85% of the risk of chronic disease comes down to environmental factors, not genetics. So that means that even if we were to change those genes, we would definitely have some impact, but we wouldn't be able to eradicate those diseases, without making environmental behavioral changes as well. So this term, the exposome, was coined by a biologist named Christopher Wilde in 2005, and as you indicated, it refers to the sum of all non-genetic exposures from the moment of conception to the moment of death. So that means it's a very broad term which encompasses everything from our individual diet to our physical activity, sleep, stress management, the things we typically think of, but it extends beyond that to things outside of our own individual bubble, like the air that we breathe, the pollution in our if we live in an urban environment, our social environment, like do we have meaningful relationships or are we isolated? And it includes things like the health of your gut microbiome, the health of your mitochondria. And we know that all of these factors, heavy metals, toxins we're exposed to, plastics. They all are impacting our health, and modulating or changing or addressing these factors is a much more important step we can take to prevent and reverse chronic disease than focusing on genes.
Hey guys, I interrupt the podcast to bring you a message from our sponsor, ATP Labs, and our featured product of the week is Estro Control, which has quickly become one of our best-selling products, both to men and women. Even though it looks pink and you may think it's a predominantly female product, I actually recommend it to a lot of my male clients. We're exposed to so many environmental estrogens, so many xenoestrogens in our drinking water, in plastic bottles, and anything we eat that's plastic can expose our body to potentially dangerous xenoestrogens. And Estro Control is a proven formula to help our body start to eliminate these xenoestrogens. So another way you can do it is with infrared saunas, but I recommend adding Estro Control for anybody who's noticing potentially decreased testosterone ratios, potentially accumulated additional fat around your bottom and your lower half and your thighs. That can often be indicative of elevated estrogen. So if you're someone who experiences some of those symptoms, head over to ATP Lab right now. Check that out. Estro Control is the product. And because you're cool and because I love you, use the code BEN10 and get 10% off. And if you sign up for their web page, email provider, let's do it one more time. And if you sign up for their VIP newsletter, you will also get free shipping. So that's super cool. 10% and free shipping. Sign up for the newsletter. Back to the episode. Enjoy. What are some of the key things that you're seeing that are moving the needle most for people? So, that was a long list of things that people should be considering and being aware of. And obviously, guys like yourself are probably aware of most of them and doing a lot to influence all of them, if not many, most of them. From your experience, obviously influencing the microbiome is big and influencing the mitochondria is big. We talked about those a little bit. What are you seeing with your patients as being some of the ones that people are missing on that move the needle the most?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say sleep and stress management are the two things that people tend to neglect the most but have the biggest impact. And, sleep, for example, let's just take something like the obesity epidemic, which is now rampant. The latest statistics from the CDC suggest that 40% of Americans are now obese. 100 million people now have either prediabetes or diabetes. That's a third of the U.S. population.
Crazy.
It's just absolutely insane. Mm-hmm. So this is a big problem, right? And
you almost wonder if that's being artificially influenced in some way to drive more sales of. That's where my brain goes. I'm like, how do you have 100 million people?
Well,
that's crazy.
I mean, that's a good thought. And you might think that, but if anything, it could be an underestimate because the cutoffs they're using are too high. Prediabetes in their mind doesn't start until you have a fasting glucose of 99 or 100 rather. But there are plenty of studies that show that if you're in the high 90s, even you're in the pre-diabetic range, you're already at much higher risk for things like heart disease and other problems. Yep. So I think that's legit. And it just highlights how wrong we've gone in terms of our diet and our lifestyle. But getting back to your question, if you were to ask most people, what are the primary drivers of type 2 of diabetes and obesity, almost everybody would say diet, right? And as number one. And then number two, they would probably say exercise or physical activity, the sedentary lifestyle. And it's true that sedentary lifestyle and physical inactivity play a big role in obesity and diabetes. But actually, most scientists now who are studying this, people who spend their whole career studying obesity and metabolism have agreed that sleep loss, sleep deprivation, chronic sleep deprivation is actually probably the number two most important factor that's driving the obesity epidemic, ahead of exercise or lack of exercise, which I think most people are pretty surprised to hear. Even a single night of sleep loss can cause insulin resistance the next day in people, and that's in healthy people with no pre-existing metabolic conditions. Sleep loss has been shown to interfere with both insulin and leptin signaling. It changes it reduces our judgment around food. So I'm sure most people have experienced that firsthand. If you have a poor night of sleep, you're much likely to eat in a way that you shouldn't. Let's just put it that way. The next day.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, right? It's a slippery slope because you wake up and you're tired, so your cortisol is probably through the roof, and you feel this low-level anxiety, and you're like, oh, I got to self-medicate myself.
Yeah.
So if you're not going to exercise, well, the best way to do it is just throw a bunch of sugar down your throat, and all of a sudden you feel better for half an hour, right?
Yeah.
Before it all happens again, you eat more sugar. So
yeah, and they've shown, I'm not remembering the exact statistics, but chronic sleep deprivation can cause an increase in calorie intake with no change in in energy expenditure that is the equivalent of gaining 50 pounds a year, and that's pretty severe sleep deprivation, in the studies. But if you walk that back and just say, okay, we know that most Americans need to sleep. Most people, not just Americans, need to sleep 7 to 8 hours a night to function properly. And we now know that more than a third of Americans are getting fewer than 6 hours of sleep. So that's for sure a third of the U.S. population that's chronically sleep deprived. And guess what? A third of the U.S. population has prediabetes and diabetes. Now, that's not an exact correlation, but we know we absolutely know that there is a connection between those two statistics.
it also seems like a chicken or the egg scenario, right? Because if your cortisol is out of whack because you're stressed, you're not going to sleep well, and you're not going to sleep well, and your cortisol is going to be out of whack. So it's kind of like one of these situations where it goes both ways, right? So
absolutely.
It's just
No
overall
doubt.
health. If you improve your overall health, chances are you're going to sleep better, right?
Yeah.
Such an interesting topic of discussion that most people are so misguided on. But at the end of the day, you just need to be healthier, make better choices, figure out ways to modulate your stress a little bit, and that kind of leads into the next conversation. Two of the things you brought up as far as things people need to change is sleep, and the other one being stress management, perception of stress. Is it just a meditation practice, or is there other ways that you suggest people modulate stress?
There are so many ways. I mean, first of all, of course, exercise is a big stress reliever for many people, and that's one of the many different benefits of exercise that go beyond just cardiovascular fitness, weight management, etc. It's a big stress reliever for many people. Spending time outdoors in nature is a really big stress reliever, and it's actually, I think, human beings are hardwired for that because we evolved in a natural environment, and I think a lot of people are suffering from what one author has called nature deficit disorder, or NDD, because so many of us are profoundly disconnected from our natural environment now, and I think we really suffer as a result. Experience of pleasure is really one of the most powerful antidotes to stress, and pleasure is very different than distraction. Some people, when they hear me say that, they're like, what are you talking about? Our whole culture is like slavishly dedicated to pleasure. I don't think that's true. I think our culture is obsessed with distraction, not pleasure. Pleasure is something that actually brings you into your body, where you become more present, more aware of your surroundings. And there's a release of endorphins, which are those feel-good chemicals that we experience. That's like the runner's high, or during sex or a massage. Whereas, watching a movie or being on social media or, playing a video game, those experiences can be fun, and they can kind of distract us, but they don't have that same biochemical effect on our bodies where there's the release of endorphins, and we relax and settle in and experience the physiological benefits of pleasure. So things like getting a massage or doing things that bring you that kind of pleasure, endorphin release, are also very powerful stress relievers. Meditation, of course, you mentioned, but there are lots of different ways at that. Things like Tai Chi or yoga, or just basic mindfulness practice, deep relaxation. There are lots of different ways depending on your belief system, religion, worldview. It doesn't have to be religious in any way. It's completely secular practice. It just means bringing your attention more into the present moment, rather than kind of obsessively thinking about stuff, the past or the future throughout the entire day, which is what most of us just do by default,
Sure.
And then having fun, actually, I think is really crucial for stress reduction as well. And I also think it's hardwired for us as humans. And there's actually been some really interesting research by psychologists like Peter Gray, who have discovered that if for inmates on death row, for example, something they share in common is that they had a lot less fun during their childhood than people, non-criminals.
Wow.
And fun, all not only humans, and not even just primates, but a lot of animals, higher, more intelligent animals, all across the board in nature have fun and play. So play seems to be like an essential part of our wiring as again, not only as humans, but as more intelligent animals. And when we don't have fun, the stress, it can really build up. So those are all really important ways that we can manage and mitigate the impacts of stress.
So living in California, Chris, I think you probably encounter this a lot, and this is a little bit more in line with my demographics. So a lot of people are obsessive and compulsive about training, right? They're obsessive and compulsive about their fitness. They're almost doing it to a point of the training no longer being a benefit to the point of it becoming a stress. Have you ever experienced that? And what are some of your thoughts along those lines?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, I've been there myself. I'm a pretty passionate person, and when I get into something, I can really go overboard. So I've had to guard against that my entire life. And I work with a lot of people like that. I work with a lot of, high-powered CEOs and executives. I work with professional and even Olympic level athletes. So this is very common. And in fact, I would say it's more in my patient population, this phenomenon that you're describing is more common. Like, I don't typically see the average American, as a patient, like someone who's not exercising and eating an unhealthy diet.
Right.
That's rare for me. My typical patient is the person that you're talking about. And so I'm constantly talking to people about the risks of overtraining. And I think there are a couple concepts that are really important to understand that help people to get why that's not a good idea. And they are resilience and metabolic reserve. So they're both basically the capacity of your body to withstand repeated changes in physiological need. And let me just say that in more layperson's terms. It's like, you think of it as like a bank account. So we all know that if we are making constant withdrawals to the bank account without making deposits, that's not going to go well, right? You can only do that for a certain period of time unless you're the U.S. government, but that's another story. Most of us, we don't get that kind of leeway. Once we become overdrawn, it's not, bad things are going to happen. And so if you're not sleeping well, which of course we just established that many people aren't, you're under a lot of stress. Those are both things that kind of break you down. They're withdrawals on the bank account. You're not eating well. That's another withdrawal. You're not doing some of these other things I just mentioned to manage stress. That's another withdrawal. And then on top of that, you add the stress of training, and it is a stress, as we established before. That's, it can be a positive stress or it can be a negative stress depending on where your bank account is, so to speak. So if you add then the significant stress, you're doing CrossFit and you're doing WODs like 4 days a week, on top of all of that other things, you're just making withdrawal after withdrawal after withdrawal with very few deposits. And that's just like that doesn't end well financially, it doesn't end well in terms of your physical health. So I'm constantly talking to patients about, like, you got to balance this out. If you want to train that hard, you better make sure that you're making deposits in every other area. You're eating a nutrient-dense diet. You're sleeping well. You're managing your stress. You're doing all the right things everywhere else, because if you don't do that, you're gonna go into the red, so to speak.
Awesome. So That's exactly the demographic I want to start talking to for the rest of the conversation today. So what are the things that, the average person, like we know they need to eat sleep, we know they need to eat well. People are already doing that. Like the guys who listen to my podcast are, high-level athletes, very educated, very, very informed on most things. So when someone comes into your office and they're exactly the demographic you're talking to right now, what do you suggest they start doing? Because they're not just looking to be healthy. Now, talking to me, an ex-professional athlete, I don't just want to be healthy, man. I want to be the best in the world, or I want to be exceptional at what I do. What are some of the things you recommend to start really pushing the needle and to make sure that you are making those deposits when, to kind of counteract the withdrawal? So, they're already eating a healthy diet. Most of them already have some degree of meditation practice. They're all sleeping pretty well. Is there anything else that you're suggesting people do to really push the envelope as far as physique enhancement and performance?
Yeah, so the first thing would be removing any obstacles. And that's why when anyone comes to see me, I do a comprehensive workup of testing. I test their gut, I test their HPA axis, their cortisol and DHEA levels, and other, testosterone and other hormones. And then I check their blood sugar, their thyroid, their metabolic, function, their nutrients, vitamin D, iron, magnesium, etc. Because all of those things are they're like the basic ingredients of health, and if you cannot optimize if you don't even have those basics. It's like building a house, a really fancy house when there's no foundation. You got to get the foundation right first. And you might be surprised, like even people who are pretty functional, who are doing really well, achieving, at a high level in their sport or, in their profession, and they come in and we do this full panel of testing and we find out, they've got, 2 or 3 nutrient deficiencies. They've got SIBO or a gut problem. They've got, their cortisol is low or high, or they're in a catabolic state because their cortisol is high and their DHEA is low. So the first step is to identify and then address all of those obstacles. And then once that's done, you've laid that strong foundation, then you can start doing the finer tweaking, which would be things like intermittent fasting or fasting. Keto in some cases can be helpful depending on the type of activity that the person is doing and what their goals are. Whereas in other cases, a much higher carbohydrate intake, if people are doing intensely glycolytic activity like, powerlifting or jiu-jitsu or something like that, would be a better option. So we start playing with macronutrient ratios, as a way of increasing and enhancing performance. As I mentioned, we might do some fasting, hot and cold training as a way of improving, mitochondrial function. We might do things like, we might start looking at supplementation depending on what their particular goal is for training. If we might do some more advanced weight loss approaches if they're trying to lean out and, either for competition or because that's, improves performance in their sport, or if they're trying to gain muscle and put on weight, we would have a different strategy for that. So it really depends on who the person is, what their health status is, what their goals are in terms of training or performance, and then, of course, what level of commitment and time that they have to put into this. So
one of the complaints we hear a lot, or the comments we get a lot, is, hey, Ben, how do I improve my testosterone? So we get a lot of guys, a lot of my demographic is 35 plus, high-performing, high-functioning entrepreneurs, high-performing athletes.
Yeah.
They go, man, I just don't have the same sex drive I used to. I don't have the same ability to build muscle that I used to. Do you have any best practices and recommendations for people, other than the obvious mitochondrial stimulation and sleep? Maybe it's supplements, maybe it's nutritional practices that would help people. And is it a testosterone thing in most people? Obviously, as we age, testosterone goes down, but some people suggest it's as a result of other things. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's actually more my answer in many cases. If a guy comes to me with low T,
Why?
the first thing I'm going to be doing is looking at his HPA axis, or HPTGA axis, so hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, gonads, adrenals. So all of those organs exist or glands exist in a very they're inexorably intertwined. They're integrated all the way through the body.
Integrated, sure.
And in many cases, when you have low testosterone, it's actually a problem that's further upstream. So there might be an issue with the pituitary and the hypothalamus, and how they are producing the stimulating hormones that trigger the gonads to release testosterone. So it's and that in turn is often related to issues elsewhere in the system. So it could be, for example, a problem with cortisol, high cortisol and low cortisol, or cortisol produced at the wrong times, which is often related to stress, not sleeping enough, not managing stress, burning the candle at both ends, overtraining, etc. All that stuff can impact cortisol and DHEA levels, which in turn then affect testosterone levels. In other cases, you might have inflammation in the gut. For example, let's say someone has a gut infection like Helicobacter pylori, a bacteria, or they've got bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, or they've got pretty severe dysbiosis. That produces inflammatory cytokines in the gut, which then travel through the bloodstream into the brain, and inflammation has been shown to suppress suppress the sensitivity of the receptors on the hypothalamus and the pituitary to some of those stimulating hormones, and interfere with that whole negative feedback cycle of hormone production. So you can get, I was talking about this before, of like when someone comes to me and they want to optimize performance, the first step is to make sure that those foundational elements are in place. And it's the same approach with testosterone. Someone might want to come and say, hey, my main concern is low testosterone. And I say, okay, I get it. We're going to focus on that. But before we do anything that would affect testosterone directly, like, either medication or supplementation or something that just is designed to kind of boost testosterone levels, the first thing that we have to do is look at all these other things that we know affect testosterone production and make sure they're in the right place. And once we do that, in many cases, the testosterone will take care of itself. If the patient is eating well, they're sleeping enough, they're managing their stress, and they're doing some of the things we've been talking about throughout the whole show, that often takes care of the problem. And when it's not taking care of the problem and I dig a little deeper, I often find that it's not, that some of those things have not actually been optimized. Usually sleep and stress are the biggest ones. Again, as I said before, that where people tend to fall off the wagon. It's much easier in some ways to just like take a new supplement or even change your diet than it is to make the changes that are required to really, really adequately get enough sleep and manage the stress. So once we've done all that, though, there are some things that can be helpful in terms of, let me just step back and say, with the cortisol levels, that can be that's not an overnight process. It's not just a question of like taking one supplement and calling it a day. I mean, it's really both a combination of of diet, behavior, and lifestyle changes, and then in some cases adaptogenic herbs and things like adrenal glandular products that can be helpful in restoring proper function. And so those are all the initial steps that people would take.
So I love that you went down the route of the gut and inflammatory cytokines, and you're an advocate of paleo-style diet, and you wrote a book called The Paleo Cure, which everyone should definitely go out and check out. I'd love to go down the route of what are the things that are causing it. We know, I want your opinion on gluten. I want your opinion on grains. What are people mistaken about? So one of the questions that comes to mind are, what are the couple of things that everyone gets wrong about optimizing gut health in relation to paleo dieting?
Yeah, well, just to be clear, I'm an advocate of what I would call a paleo template or a paleo style diet, where I think most people should try a basic paleo type of approach at least for a month and see how it works, and then you can consider adding back some of what I call gray area foods that if they're well tolerated and you don't have a problem with them, I think they're just fine. So those would be things like chocolate, moderate alcohol intake, even full fat fermented dairy products like butter and cream, and then even some properly prepared grains and legumes can work for people if they don't have any issue with them. So I think that's one thing that people often get wrong is if they the diet has to be tailored to each person. So I often say there's no one size fits all approach when it comes to diet. We have to tailor our diet based on our genes, our gene expression, our health status, whether we're healthy or dealing with a chronic illness, what our goals are. So like if you think about a primarily sedentary office worker who's 60 pounds overweight and has prediabetes, their diet should be really different from someone who is lean and like a competitive triathlete. That should go without saying, but I'm often surprised to see how those two people will be following the same just kind of like low carb paleo diet because they read about it online. So we really need to tailor our diet based on our particular needs and circumstances and goals. So that's probably the biggest one. And then I think the second one is related to the first one, which is a lot of people end up on what I call an accidental low carb diet, which is, they're on a standard American diet where they're eating like pizza and cookies and crackers and really super high carbohydrate intake. And then they hear about paleo or something like that, and they do it, and they cut out all those, flour and sugar-based carbs, which is good, but they don't replace those carbohydrates with more nutrient-dense paleo-friendly choices like sweet potatoes or plantains or, or even white potatoes. And what happens is for some people that's actually a recipe for breakdown. Because if you take someone who's super physically active, who's doing a lot of glycolytic intense activity, and in many cases they're going to need more carbohydrate to function and perform optimally. And if they go on a super low carb diet, then that often ends up with they develop insomnia, their performance tanks, they start having a lot of issues. Another group, demographic or group that tends to experience that with a low carb diet is women. Women in particular who are have kids. They're also working, and then they're also doing intense activity like CrossFit or something like that. They're really making a lot of withdrawals in the bank account, as we were talking about earlier. And on top of that, they do a really low-carb diet without enough calories or carbohydrates to fuel their activity levels, and that often ends up in a pretty horrific crash.
That's great. That's actually one of my questions I wanted to bring up was, I'd say, a huge percentage of the population that I encounter has constantly elevated or chronically elevated levels of cortisol. And then, the question you get and I get all the time is, hey man, should I be doing fasting and should I be doing intermittent fasting? Mm-hmm. Do you recommend fasting for everyone, or is it the type of thing that there may be some qualifications for?
Definitely some qualifications. I would say the women in particular, that hypothetical woman that I just mentioned, she might be able to tolerate 1 or 2 days a week of intermittent fasting on like a 16-8 window, if compressing food intake into 8 hours. But if she intermittent fasts every day, it's often going to make her worse rather than better. But of course, you need to tailor this even more. So let's say that you have two women who fit into that demographic, but one is pretty overweight, and her adrenals, despite the fact that she's doing everything that I just mentioned, she's tolerating it pretty well, and her cortisol levels are fairly normal. She might be able to tolerate intermittent fasting, and further, it could actually help her feel more energetic and better because it's going to improve her metabolic function and help her lose weight. Mm-hmm. But if you take another woman who's in that same bracket overall, but she's got low cortisol and she's really not sleeping well, and she's lean, if not underweight, then fasting is going to put her probably into even further hypocaloric state, not getting enough calories, and reduce her carbohydrate intake even further and push her further into the hole. So it's definitely not something that everybody should do.
Chris, how do you feel about fitness enthusiasts, bodybuilders, anyone who's kind of into this intense training world, and the necessity to eat protein every 2.5 to 3 hours?
In many cases, that's not necessary. There are some situations like where you mentioned if someone's really competitively training, that they might benefit from that, particularly if they're doing weightlifting or other intensive muscle building activities. But even for a pretty high level competitive athlete outside of that demographic, that frequency of food intake and protein intake is not necessary. People that are accustomed to that, there's sometimes a little bit of an adjustment time when you switch to an approach where there's more time in between meals and you're not snacking constantly. But most of the research suggests, especially over the longer term, that very frequent eating and snacking is not beneficial for health.
Mm-hmm. So moving along, what do you think the ideal, I know there's no answer to this, but what do you think the ideal nutrient split looks like for the average healthy, fit person?
Yeah. So again, it's hard to say that, but of course, in my book, I had to provide a starting place that people can begin from and then customize, against. I think that's the key thing. So whatever I say here, you just consider it a starting place, and then you tweak to your own needs. So generally, I would say protein around 15 to 20%. And the good thing about protein is we have very strong hardwired mechanisms that govern our intake of protein based on our need for it. So such that if you are getting more protein than you need, you will have a very strong aversion to eating protein, even to the point of feeling nauseous. Pregnant women often report this. And one of the reasons for that is that the need for protein actually drops a little bit in pregnancy. And excess protein intake can be harmful. And so that's why a lot of women often, who love eating meat and animal products, before pregnancy are often surprised to learn that, or feel that kind of aversion to the same level of animal protein during pregnancy. It's a totally natural response. And then,
interesting.
So you don't typically have to worry too much about counting, macronutrients with protein, because you'll just eat, in most cases, the amount that's right for you just by following your craving for it. For carbohydrate, I typically recommend around 20 to 25% of calories. And that is makes a couple of assumptions. Number one, that those are coming from, paleo-friendly sources like sweet potatoes and whole fruit. And if you have access to them, things like plantains and taro and yucca. And then the second assumption is that person is active and not sedentary. And so then the rest would be fat. So the way I advise people is you just need to pay kind of most attention to the carbohydrate. The protein takes care of itself, and then everything else is, will be fat. So that's a really easy way for people to think about it, because then they don't have to, count fat calories and carb calories and protein calories. They just count the carbs, and the rest takes care of itself.
Awesome. So I have an interesting question around protein. So would you recommend, or would you suggest that someone's predisposition to want to consume protein has to do with their genetics or with their blood type? Or, I know some people who could go days without wanting protein, then I know some people who want, 12 to 15 ounces a meal.
Yeah.
Could be a learned trait, but is there some predisposing factors there that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I don't think it's as much genetic. There probably is some influence related to what's happening in the gut, although I'm not familiar with any specific research there. It often more comes down to activity levels and the type of activity that's being done. And yes, there are some genetic certain genes that affect our ability to process and absorb proteins, and therefore might make us less likely to want to be like on the high end of that spectrum of protein consumption. And there may be some historical, some genes related to it that we don't fully know about, and there's some cultural or geographical influence. For example, there are some cultures, traditional cultures like the Tukasenta, which is a group of hunter-gatherers in Papua New Guinea, that consume 97% of their calories as carbohydrate. They mostly just eat sweet potatoes, and the only protein and fat they get are like from the insects that happen to be on the sweet potatoes that they eat. And the people who go around saying that carbs are the cause of the obesity epidemic need to go and hang out with the Tukasenta, because those people are lean and fit and free of obesity or any metabolic or inflammatory diseases. And then you have other traditional peoples who ate a much higher protein intake, like the Maasai in Africa, who consume primarily, they're a pastoralist culture that raise cows, and so they mostly eat the flesh of their cows and the organs, and then they drink the milk and the blood of the cows. So that, they eat some other stuff too, but that's their protein intake is obviously much higher, and their fat intake is much higher than the Tukasenta, and yet they're both healthy. So it just shows that it's probably more about what we're not eating, pizza and grain-based desserts and drinking, sugar-sweetened beverages and things like that. But within the template of the nutrient-dense whole foods that we've been eating for the vast majority of our history as humans, there's actually a pretty wide variation of what we can tolerate and thrive on based on a number of different factors.
Chris, one of the really interesting things that you talk about a little bit is reinventing healthcare. Can you tell me what that looks like?
Yeah, well, my own story, that's what this evolved out of, is my own story. And, as I said in the beginning, conventional medicine was just not really set up very well for addressing chronic disease. It's really good if you get into, like, if you break your arm, for example, you're going if you need to have LASIK eye surgery, if you have a gallbladder attack and you need to have your gallbladder removed, or perhaps a cancerous tumor, conventional medicine's awesome for that kind of thing. But it really does not do very well with chronic disease. And the key thing to understand is that chronic disease is really what's bringing us to our knees at this point. 7 of the 10 causes for death now, top 10 causes of death, are all chronic diseases, not acute problems. So that is how we need to reinvent our healthcare system so that it is better able to deal with the chronic diseases that are shortening our lifespan and destroying our quality of life and threatening to bankrupt our government.
So one final question for you, man. Obviously, throughout your health issues, you probably experience pretty substantial, I'm being presumptive here, but pretty substantial changes to your brain chemistry and your ability to think. I'm going to guess because of your microbiome was probably influenced in some way. If you could talk about that a little bit, and then fast forwarding to now, what are some of the things you do now to optimize your brain health? Obviously, you're a very highly functioning individual, so I think a lot of us want to get the most out of our brain.
Yeah, definitely. There's a strong connection between the gut and the brain. This is known as the gut-brain axis, and it's been a huge focus of research over the past several years. So optimizing your gut health through things like bone broth, fermented food, and fermentable fiber, prebiotic foods and fiber is really important. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, sleep is probably the number one thing we can do for our brains, and this has been consistently shown in study after study, and everybody has had this experience. If you don't sleep well, your brain just does not work very well the next day. What's interesting about this is that they've done studies and shown that people who don't sleep well, they tend to rate their performance a lot higher than objective indicators would suggest. So what that means is we tend to get accustomed or adapted to our lower level of performance and think that it's normal. And it's only when objective measurements are used for cognitive performance that we realize that we're actually not performing at a high level. So that's really important for people to know, because they think, oh, I'm doing fine. Well, that's because you've just adapted to your lower level of performance, and it feels like it's normal. Adequate, physical activity, not too much and not too little. Overtraining can really tax brain function because of the link with cortisol. And I mentioned the whole HPTGA axis, which overtraining affects. Most of that is in the brain. The hypothalamus and the pituitary hypothalamus is in the brain, pituitary just below. That's the part of our bodies that's going to be really affected by overtraining, in addition to our other aspects of our physiology. I think giving your brain the right fuel, and so for many people, that's just a nutrient-dense, whole foods, anti-inflammatory diet, some paleo template type of thing. But for some people, especially people who have insulin resistance or leptin resistance, their brains may not be able to process glucose very well, and that's where a ketogenic diet can really excel. I mean, I would say the two primary benefits of a ketogenic diet for when it's appropriate, because it's not for everybody, are weight loss and an improvement in cognitive function. And I would even say that improved cognitive function is more frequently a benefit than weight loss. I've had people who just don't lose weight on keto and even gain weight, but I've almost never had somebody who does keto who doesn't experience some cognitive benefit. And in some cases, it can take someone who's got cognitive impairment or even early onset Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's or early Parkinson's. It can take them from that back to normal function, which is pretty amazing.
Fascinating. So, Chris, tell me about this health coach training that you're actually starting to offer coming up in April.
Yeah. So, part of you asked in the very first question, what am I excited about, and what's my progression was, first addressing my own health issues, then going into private practice as a clinician to help people address their individual issues, then realizing that while that's important and helpful, and I continue to do that work, that we can't really even talk about individual health without talking about healthcare, the bigger system. And as I started to do the deep dive into our healthcare system and what we need to fix it, I realized that the single biggest, most important change we need to make in order to prevent and reverse disease is to address our diet, lifestyle, and behavior, which of course we've been talking about for the entire show. And then, then if you reach that conclusion, then you ask yourself the question, who are the best people to do this? It's very clear that the answer is not doctors. It's not because they're not capable of doing it. It's because they're not trained to do it, and they don't have enough time. They don't have enough time to do it in the way our healthcare system is set up. The average appointment with the primary care doctor now is 10 minutes. So there's no possible way that you can have a meaningful conversation with someone about their diet, lifestyle, and behavior in a 10-minute visit when you're also going over lab tests and prescribing treatment and all of that. Right. So health coaches are actually the ideal people to be working with folks on diet, lifestyle, and behavior. And the good news, they can be trained in a relatively short period of time. They don't need to have 10 years of science background and pre-med requirements in order to do it. They don't need to go into $200,000 of debt in order to get that kind of training. And yet they can have a really meaningful, huge impact on people's lives. And I think in the next several years, you're going to see health coaches incorporated into every medical clinic, not just functional and integrative medicine, but even on the conventional medicine side. So I'm really excited about this. I think it's the future of medicine. And we are launching our health coach training program in June with enrollment starting in April. And you can find out more about that at KresserInstitute.com.
Chris, thank you so much, man. That's absolutely amazing. Kresser.com. You guys can go there and join the revolution to reinvent healthcare. Sign up for Chris's book and a whole bunch of other awesome stuff, man. Thank you so much for your time and knowledge. All right, so how was that for a great podcast, ladies and gents? Chris Kresser Gave us tons of information about the microbiome, exposomics, epigenetics, diabetes, daily health practices, so much awesome stuff about how to live your greatest life. So if you enjoyed it, I think Chris would definitely appreciate you going over there and checking out his website, which is kresser.com. And I would appreciate it if you left us a review. And if you know somebody who you think will benefit from this information, go ahead and share it with them now. And if you want to live your best life in your best body, the best place to do it is at Mi40Nation.com. Right now, we're launching our best product ever, our best program, teaching you how to build your best body. Weak body part development for any body type. Hypertrophy execution mastery is what it's called. It's included in a month membership of Mi40 Nation, and you guys are going to love it. It's exactly what I teach here at my camps and all these secrets that I've been accumulating over the last 20 years. So check that out at Mi40Nation.com. And as always, have an incredible day and live your greatness.